So it's about the Irish potato famine, the Great Famine. The Gaelic, it's An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger. I'm going to start off with a quote from Wolfe Tone from the 1798 rebellion, who founded the Society of United Irishmen. To subvert the tyranny of our execrable government, to break the connection with England, the never-failing source of our political evils, and to assert the independence of my country, these were my objects. To unite the whole people of Ireland, to abolish the memory of all past dissensions, and to substitute the common name of Irishman in place of the denomination of Protestant, Catholic, and Dissenter. These were my means. So that was sort of 50 years before this. And of course, there's been a tremendously long history of the struggle for independence for Ireland. The political side of it, I don't treat in great depth on this. It's interesting as well, just that, President Joe Biden visited Ireland recently, and he is really strongly pro-Irish. And the reason for this is that his great-great-grandfather, who's called Blewett, that's his second name, strange name, isn't it? Was born there in County Mayo in 1832. And his family later on in that century emigrated to America after the famine. So he's very much aware of this. And interestingly, County Mayo, my own family history, my great-great-grandmother came from County Mayo as well. So I've got a link with Joe Biden there. It's about the potato blight. There's a horrible picture of a potato. If you've ever had potatoes like that, it's horrible to come across this mushy mess when you're hoping to get your potato crop in. So it occurred in that period. It was a severe food shortage, mass starvation, and caused by the failure of the potato crop. Now, in the 1840s, Ireland was very much an agricultural society, a heavy reliance on potato, and also they exported a lot of it because a lot of the industrialization of Britain and America was beginning at this time as well. And the population shot up a bit like it did in England as well, from about 3 million in 1750 to about 8.4 million in 1845, which apparently was half the size of the rest of the British Isles. It was a very large population and, relatively speaking, well off. Though the problems with the potato famine were made worse by the oppressive British colonial policies and their land tenure systems, about which more later. The arrival of the disease Phytophthora infestans, commonly known as blight, came in 1844 to Ireland, and the origin of infestans, P. infestans, I can see why they call it P. infestans rather than trying to pronounce that.
Phytophthora.
Thank you. It's commonly known as blight anyway, and it can be traced to the Toluca Valley in Mexico. Then it spread first to North America and then to Europe, presumably on ships. But when it was first harvested in October 1845, the scale of destruction became really apparent. So the population growth in Ireland had been driven by the subdivision of land and the spread to the use of the potato. And about nearly 1.5 million families were living on tiny farms of fewer than 5 acres. And this is a picture of a starving Irish family from Carew, County Galway during the Great Famine. And it looks like a photograph, and it's from the National Library of Ireland, but it's a very early photograph if it is, isn't it?
Mm.
So this was the graph of potato production during the Great Famine. And you can see there, it just fell off a cliff in 1845. And continued like that for many, many years. So it was an absolutely catastrophic failure. And this is the scene at Skibbereen during the Great Famine by the Cork artist who'd been sent out by the Illustrated London News to make sketches of it. It's a very iconic photo engraving. This it's And there they are, presumably trying to look for any potato pickings that they could use. And Skibbereen is the one. Interestingly, there are very few songs from this period that have survived. Given that the music tradition in Ireland is massive, it's surprising that so few survived. And it's probably, first of all, that there weren't many people around who can sing about it, and secondly, it was not much. It wasn't anything to sing about at the time. It was deeply, deeply felt. So that it was one of the few songs that survived, and which I think it's why it is quite important. I'll come back onto that later. Ireland finally became the Irish Free State in 1921, with all the connotations of partition and so on that are with us to this day. By then, half of its population was already abroad or had died of disease or starvation. It was a century-long population decline, which was unheard of in any other European country. It continued to our day, the population decline. And of course, one of the solutions for people who were faced with this tremendous starvation was, of course, emigration. During this period, over half of the immigrants to America were from Ireland. And there's the engraving on the right predicts it as well. It wasn't so much, families didn't migrate en masse. It's the younger members of the family who were sent. Because of this, there were also as many women emigrated as men, which is very unusual for emigrations. They would send back remittances, which totaled about 1.5 million by 1851, back to the family in Ireland, which in turn allowed other members of their family to leave. That's the way that it happened. And of course, it wasn't just to Ireland, it was to Britain as well. Part of the events that were going on, there were various tragedies. The Dúlach tragedy in 1845, it's in southwest County Mayo, again, the county my relatives came from. At least 7 and perhaps 20 or significantly more starving people died after being forced to walk for miles to present themselves for inspection in the poor law by poor law officials who would then determine whether they could continue to receive outdoor relief. There is now actually a Dúlach trail for the people who can take the walk that was taken by those people when they died. It's terribly, terribly. You can see why it's got deeply into the heart of the Irish psyche, this. One interesting side aspect of this were the Choctaw Native American Indians. I don't know if you know about this. When they learned of this tragedy in 1845, members of the Choctaw tribe raised $710, which they donated to the Irish Family Relief. And this was partly because less than 20 years earlier, the Choctaw were forcibly removed from their land by the white man to make way for modern-day Oklahoma. Their march was some 500 miles and they lost lives along the way, which became known as the Trail of Tears.
Something to learn from that, isn't there?
Isn't there just?
About empathy and...
Yeah, empathy between
Well,
people.
in a way, it reminds me a bit of the Lancashire cotton workers who refused to accept the cotton from the southern states of America during the Civil War and were praised very specifically by President Lincoln for doing that. So these things happen and they give you some faith in humanity, don't they? There's a picture of them on the left, and this is the Kindred Spirits memorial, which is in Bailick Park in Middleton in County Cork. It consists of 9 20-feet stainless steel eagle feathers arranged in a circle, no 2 feathers being identical, forming a bowl shape to represent a gift of a bowl of food. So these are the population sizes, and you can see it's just incredible, the decline that happened. The reason that the potato famine was particularly bad in Ireland, because they relied on a single variety of potato known as the Irish lumper. And this lack of genetic variability caused had such devastating effects in Ireland and in other countries in Europe, though none of those had the same levels of famine that Ireland did. And this shows the populations of Ireland and Europe. The blue is the European graph of populations, which shows that we went against the normal explosion in population that was going on in the industrialized countries of Western Europe. This is a very famous quote from John Mitchell, who wrote something called The Last Conquest of Ireland, perhaps in brackets, in 1861. The Almighty indeed sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine. But Mitchell, because of this pamphlet, he was convicted in England by a packed jury under the newly enacted Treason Felony Act and sentenced to 14 years transportation to Bermuda for saying this. So at least a million people were thought to have emigrated. A quarter of Liverpool's population was Irish born by 1851. Not quite as many in Manchester, but very high proportion. In Manchester and Greater Manchester, there are an awful lot of people of Irish descent. And I don't know, Brian, are you one of those as well?
Yeah, my granddad came to Manchester during the First World War. He was injured in the First World War, and they put him in a hospital. I think it was in Salford. I don't know which one precisely, but there he met his wife. She was Irish also, and working in the hospital. That's where my connection is. My great granddad came over during the First World War. He came to Manchester and stayed because he met the woman he married, or grandma, as I like to call her.
So there are about a million long-distance emigrants going mainly to North America, and the short-distance emigrants were 200,000, though it's actually thought there were far more than that. And as many as 4.5 million Irish arrived in America between 1820 and 1930. So this is a picture of my granddad, Thomas Geraghty, at the top, who died in 1924, leaving, and he died shortly after my grandmother died. She was called Elizabeth, and he was devastated by her death from TB and drank himself to death effectively. So my mother was left as an orphan. The two redoubtable women in the front are his mother and his grandmother, and certainly his grandmother came from County Mayo. And in fact had quite a checkered history. I came across some Dublin police records. She'd been arrested for drunkenness one time. Like a lot of them, the Irish families tended to stick together. There was a street, full of Geraghties from that had come over, because of course it was part of England and they could come over whenever they wanted to, part of the United Kingdom. That was my Aunt Agatha, who's the baby. His other daughter, Celia, who's my mother, she eventually married Frank Leach, and the rest is history. This is trying to get a bit onto the politics of it. There was a new Whig government. The government changed between Tories and Whigs over this period. It was very, very confusing when you're trying to research it. And they abandoned the policy of public works to give people work and replaced it with workhouses and soup kitchens. And as the cost of the poor law fell on local landlords, to reduce their liability, many evicted their tenants. There were an awful lot. They'd evict them and they'd burn their houses as they left. 250,000 people were officially evicted between 1849 and 53. And
that's happening now, Bernard, to renters. A lot of landlords are selling their properties because of, the general situation, and people are being evicted now.
There are a lot of lessons to be learned, I think, from this for us now. You're quite right.
Yeah, I was thinking, nothing's changing, is it? It's.
Well, I mean,
I've heard that the poorer landowners in Ireland, which had probably, just have a farm enough to keep their family going, they had to sell up the farm because they couldn't afford to pay the money the government put a tax on them. to pay for the poor lord, which they couldn't afford. So they had to. So the bigger landowners bought more and more land
at a cut price.
prices.
Yes, yes, that's right. They just quickly got rid of the tenants because they had to pay for them if they were poor, and they didn't like that. So no issue has provoked so much anger and embittered relations between England and Ireland. And this is a quote from Woodham Smith, the historian: "The indisputable fact that huge quantities of food were exported from Ireland to England throughout the period when the people of Ireland were dying of starvation," which is a startling fact. I could have given several examples of this, but here's George Bingham, 3rd Earl of Lucan. Have you heard of a Lord Lucan before?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
I imagine it's from the same family. He owned about 60,000 acres and he was amongst the worst evicting landlords, and is quoted as saying that he would not breed paupers to pay priests. Having turned out in the parish of Ballinrobe over 2,000 tenants alone, he then used the cleared land as grazing farms. This, I think, is interesting. At the back of the words are taken from records which there are all over the registrars in the UK of the amounts being paid to slave owners as compensation to West Indian slave owners, which went on, I think, apparently to the 1970s, these payments.
Yeah, it's only recently been paid off, hasn't it?
Well, according to the
Dreadful.
to Peter Gray's book, The Irish Famine, the government spent 7 million for relief in Ireland between 1845 and 50, representing less than 0.5% of the British gross national product over 5 years. Contemporaries noted the sharp contrast with the 20 million compensation given to West Indian slave owners in the 1830s. They were treated as colonial subjects, and this is something to do with their view of Irish people. So they were getting similar treatment. So this was going on, of course, with the famines in India that England, well, if not responsible for, was responsible for the incredible, huge effects of them. Bringing it up to date, this is, the slave trade has become much more of an important issue recently. Do you remember this? In Bristol Harbour, where they dragged it and
Yes,
threw it into the harbour. It was quite a seminal moment, I thought, that about it. This is on the Ballymurphy Road in Belfast, and Gorta Mór, Britain's genocide by starvation, Ireland's Holocaust, 1845 to 1849, over 1.5 million deaths, 500,000 deaths. You can see where they got that from. So they certainly see it as a genocide. There's a lot of debate about that, about whether it actually counts as a genocide, but certainly we didn't do well on this as a country. Here's a famine memorial in Dublin, which I think is very poignant.
Very evocative, isn't
very
it?
stark, isn't it?
Mm.
And this is the National Famine Memorial, which was only erected in 2021 in County Mayo. Same county again comes up. Consists of a bronze sculpture of a coffin ship. They call them coffin ships, so many people died on them. Remember, people were going to these in starvation, and there wasn't necessarily any food on board for them. So with skeletons interwoven through the rigging of the ship, symbolizing the many emigrants who didn't survive the journey across the ocean, seeking a better life.
Amazing.
One of the things was about the images that were there of Irish people. I just did a search for images of Irish people in Punch magazine, 19th century, and these are the sort of things that came up. I'll show you one of these in detail. This is called the Irish Tempest by Tenniel. I don't know whether that's the same Tenniel who did Dickens. I imagine it is. The artist Sir John Tenniel depicts Rory of the Hills as a version of the monstrous Caliban from Shakespeare's The Tempest in an untamed and virtually inhuman form. The shape of the Irishman's body and face attest to the animalistic characteristics that usually accompanied English descriptions of the Irish in the 19th century. The jaw and masses of unkempt facial hair render the Irishman more apish than human. It's the body as a whole is a massive torso supporting on muscular but goatish legs adds to the animalistic portrayal. His thick dagger-like teeth, his slouched thrusting body, his clenched and outstretched fist, and his store of weapons all emphasize the aggressiveness and violence that the English attributed to the Irish. The upright figure of Gladstone, protecting the lovely and frightened Lady Hibernia, provides a contrast which renders the Irishman even more repulsive and brutal. Though Ireland itself is depicted as a beautiful, innocent Hibernia, the Irish Fenians are depicted as a threatening, ragged, Rory Caliban. And this was all to do with the Irish Land Bill and the Irish question in general in Parliament. Should the Irish be allowed to govern themselves, or should the English save Ireland from their own people? How am I moving on to Wimpy? Do you remember Wimpy, the construction firm?
Oh,
Yes.
Well, just
Yes.
to show attitudes towards the Irish when I was young were very negative. They were called paddies, weren't they, and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember my brother coming home with a saying, "Do you know what Wimpy stands for?" That's a construction firm. I said, no.
No.
He says, we import more paddies every year.
Oh dear.
But it just showed
Wow.
you the attitudes. That they came over here and they were known, certainly were construction workers. They were responsible for a lot of the Manchester Canal and the many
Yeah.
thousand deaths that's occurred
Yes.
there, which we've talked
They
about.
were.
It does seem a very important era and one we should be aware of.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Because of the
Yeah.
impact here, and it's the whole way in which they were using the notion of this as a way of a lot of people were very happy. A lot of politicians were very happy for the Irish to be decimated by this because they thought they were getting rid of an inferior breed, and it was very much Malthusian in its approach. And you could say there may be some similar things going on today in the prejudice against immigrants and the attitudes towards them, though not to the degree I don't think that happened then. We're in the last minute, I'm afraid. Any quick comments? Maureen, you've got Irish background, haven't you?
Yeah, so I've got like an Irish nana, that was the father's mother, and then obviously gran, single parent, so that was different. They liked a Guinness, so yeah, but on my father's side, yeah, did have an Irish nana.
Good.
Yeah.
Nigel's dad came over to work on the farm up at Appleby, where he met Nigel's mother.
There you go.
And he was barefoot in Ireland before he came over.
Wow.
Yes, my mother's maiden name was Dennis, which is Irish. There's a company, that moves stuff.